The answers would determine whether the Laleh Nazari case was finally approaching its conclusion, or whether the darkest chapters were yet to be revealed. The forensic examination of the burned cabin site took 5 days, as investigators worked in the thin mountain air under challenging conditions. Dr. Hassan Amiri, the medical examiner who had presided over Laleh's remains months earlier, found himself once again sifting through the physical remnants of violence and death. The cabin had burned so intensely that most organic material had been completely consumed, leaving only metal fragments, bone pieces, and the ghostly outlines of where furniture and personal belongings had once stood. What they found among the ashes painted a final, disturbing picture of Ahmed Kargar's last days. Fragments of electronic equipment suggested he had been monitoring police communications, tracking the progress of their investigation and the search efforts aimed at finding him. Melted plastic and metal components indicated he had destroyed computer equipment and storage devices, eliminating potential evidence about other crimes or accomplices. Most significantly, they discovered the remains of what appeared to be a homemade explosive device. The cabin hadn't simply caught fire. Kargar had rigged it to explode, ensuring that if he couldn't escape capture, he would take his secrets with him into death. It was a final act of control from someone who had spent years manipulating and destroying the lives of others. The dental remains found in the cabin were positively identified as belonging to Ahmed Kargar, bringing an end to the manhunt that had consumed so many resources and generated such intense public interest. But his death by his own hand left investigators with the frustrating reality that many questions would never be answered. How many victims had there really been? Were there other accomplices? What psychological dynamics had driven the partnership between the two cousins? Dr. Rostami, the forensic psychiatrist, provided his final assessment of the case during a debriefing session with the investigation team. "We're dealing with what I would classify as a symbiotic killing partnership," he explained, his voice carrying the weight of months spent trying to understand the minds of killers. Rahmani provided the obsessive focus and victim selection, while Kargar provided the capacity for violence and body disposal. Neither one alone might have escalated to murder, but together they created a system that could identify, stalk, and eliminate victims with disturbing efficiency. The revelation of Kargar's journal and the confirmation of multiple murders had transformed public perception of the case from a tragic but isolated incident to evidence of a systematic predatory operation that had been targeting young women for years. The families of other missing women cases that had previously been treated as separate, unconnected disappearances now had to confront the possibility that their loved ones had been victims of the same killers who had taken Laleh Marjan. Hosseini had been 22 when she disappeared from a shopping center parking lot 18 months before Laleh's death. Her parents, who had spent that entire time believing she might have left voluntarily after an argument with her boyfriend, now learned that her name was among those listed in Kargar's journal. The relief of finally knowing what had happened to their daughter was overwhelmed by the horror of learning how she had died. For all these months, we told ourselves that maybe she was somewhere safe. Maybe she would call us someday. Marjan's mother, Faraday, said through tears during a press conference where several victim families gathered to demand answers. We even hoped that she had started a new life somewhere else. But to know that she was killed by these animals and that we were living with false hope all this time. I don't know how we're supposed to heal from this. Similar scenes played out in homes across Tehrangrad as the full scope of the killing partnership became clear. The journal entries were brief and crude, but they provided enough detail for investigators to match victims to specific crimes. In total, they were able to confirm 7 murders spanning a 3-year period, with Laleh being the most recent victim. The pattern that emerged was chillingly systematic. Rahmani would identify potential victims through his work in the cosmetics industry, studying their routines and personalities until he became convinced of some imaginary romantic connection. When his advances were ignored or rejected as any reasonable person would do when confronted by an unwanted stranger, he would enlist Kargar as help in what the journal euphemistically referred to as teaching them about love. The murders themselves had been brutal and calculated. In each case, The women had been abducted from locations where they felt safe, parking lots near their workplaces, walking routes they used regularly, even from their own homes. In some instances, Kargar's criminal experience and physical strength had made him an effective predator, while Rahmani's legitimate business reasons for being in various neighborhoods had provided perfect cover for surveillance and planning. What made the crimes particularly insidious was how the killers had exploited the victims' normal social interactions and professional obligations. Several of the women had been approached by Rahmani in his official capacity as a cosmetics distributor, creating situations where they felt obligated to be polite and professional, even when they might have sensed something was wrong. Nazreen Marathi, who owned a small beauty supply store, had survived an encounter with Rahmani just months before Laleh's death on experience that took on terrifying new meaning in light of the investigation's findings. He came to my store several times, always very polite and professional, she recalled during her interview with investigators. But there was something about the way he looked at me, the personal questions he would ask. He wanted to know about my schedule, where I lived, whether I was married. I thought he was just being friendly, maybe a little inappropriate, but I never imagined. Her voice trailed off as she contemplated how close she might have come to becoming another victim. The only thing that had saved her, investigators believed, was her decision to install a security system after a break-in at a neighboring business's system that would have made abduction from her store much more difficult and risky. As the full scope of the crimes became public knowledge, the case sparked a national conversation about women's safety, the warning signs of predatory behavior, and the failures of various systems that should have provided protection. Women's advocacy groups organized conferences and workshops, teaching people to recognize stalking behaviors and encouraging victims to report suspicious attention, even when it seemed relatively harmless. The cosmetics and beauty industry underwent significant changes as companies revised their policies for sales representatives and service providers. Background checks became more comprehensive, supervision increased, and many businesses adopted codes that limited the amount of personal information their employees were expected to share with vendors or clients. But for Behnam Rahmani, sitting in a jail cell awaiting trial, these broader social implications seemed irrelevant. His psychological evaluation had revealed a man so disconnected from reality that he struggled to understand why he was being prosecuted. Even when confronted with physical evidence linking him to multiple murders, he continued to insist that he had been trying to help the women, to protect them from a dangerous world that didn't appreciate their true value. He genuinely believes he was acting out of love, Dr. Rastami explained to the prosecutor's office as they prepared their case. In his mind, the women he stalked were partners in romantic relationships, even though those relationships existed entirely in his imagination. When reality contradicted his delusions, when the women showed fear or rejection instead of gratitude and affection, he interpreted their responses as confusion or external manipulation rather than genuine preference. This psychological profile became crucial as the prosecution team, led by Deputy Prosecutor Shirin Kazemi, built their case against Rahmani. Kazemi was a veteran prosecutor who had handled numerous violent crimes, but the Rahmani case presented unique challenges. His obvious mental illness might generate sympathy from some jurors, but it also made him potentially more dangerous than a killer who acted from more comprehensible motives like greed or anger. The defendant's delusions don't excuse his crimes, Kazemi argued during pre-trial hearings. If anything, they make him more dangerous to society. A killer who acts from rage or greed might be deterred by consequences or satisfied by achieving his goals. But someone whose violent actions stem from fixed delusions will continue to pose a threat, as long as those delusions persist. The trial of Behnam Rahmani began on September 15th, exactly 6 months after Laleh Nazari's disappearance. The courthouse in downtown Tehrangrad was surrounded by media trucks and protesters, with women's rights activists calling for justice and mental health advocates arguing for treatment rather than punishment. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was tense and emotional. with family members of multiple victims present to witness the proceedings. Judge Mason Horasani, respected veteran of the criminal court system, had the challenging task of presiding over a case that combined legal complexity with intense public scrutiny. The evidence against Rahmani was overwhelming: physical evidence, psychological evaluations, witness testimony, and his own incriminating statements. But the question of his mental competency to stand trial had been debated for weeks leading up to the proceedings. The prosecution's case unfolded methodically over 2 weeks, with testimony from investigators, forensic experts, family members, and survivors who had encountered Rahmani during his stalking activities. Detective Karimi, now promoted to lieutenant as recognition for his work on the case, walked the jury through the painstaking investigation that had ultimately identified Rahmani as the primary perpetrator. The evidence shows a pattern of escalating predatory behavior spanning several years. Karimi testified, his voice steady despite the emotional weight of the material he was presenting. The defendant systematically targeted young women, studied their routines and vulnerabilities, and then enlisted his cousin's help in killing them when they failed to respond to his advances. This wasn't impulsive violence, it was calculated, methodical murder. The testimony of family members was particularly difficult to witness. Laleh Nazari took the stand wearing a black dress and carrying a framed photograph of her daughter, her dignified composure barely concealing the grief that had consumed her life for months. As she described Laleh's dreams and aspirations, her close relationships with family and friends, and the devastating impact of her loss, several jurors were visibly moved to tears. "My daughter was 24 years old," Laleh said, her voice clear but fragile. "She had her whole life ahead of her. She was building a successful business, planning for the future, talking about maybe getting married and having children someday. This man took all of that away, not just from Laleh, but from everyone who loved her. We will never see her graduate from business school, never dance at her wedding, never hold her children. He stole our future, along with hers." The defense team, led by experienced criminal attorney Hassan Maradi, faced the nearly impossible task of creating reasonable doubt in the minds of jurors, while acknowledging their client's obvious mental illness. Their strategy focused on arguing that Rahmani's delusions had rendered him incapable of forming the criminal intent necessary for murder convictions, and that he should be found not guilty by reason of mental defect. "My client is not a monster," Maradi argued during his opening statement. "He is a deeply sick man who lost touch with reality and made tragic decisions based on delusions that felt completely real to him. The evidence will show that Behnam Rahmani genuinely believed he was protecting and helping these women, not harming them. While his actions were undeniably wrong and caused tremendous suffering, they stemmed from mental illness, not criminal intent." The defense called several psychiatric experts who testified about the nature of and other delusional disorders, explaining how someone in Rahmani's mental state might interpret rejection as encouragement and violence as protection. Dr. Ahmad Hosseini, a prominent psychiatrist from Tehran University, spent hours on the stand describing the complex ways that mental illness can distort perception and judgment. Individuals with severe erotomania often develop elaborate justifications for their behavior. Dr. Hosseini explained to the jury, in their minds, they are not stalking or harassing their targets, they are courting them according to some internal logic that makes perfect sense to them but appears bizarre to outside observers. When their advances are rejected, they may interpret this as evidence that their beloved is confused, threatened by others, or testing their devotion. But the prosecution's rebuttal was devastating. Prosecutor Kazemi methodically demonstrated that despite his mental illness, Rahmani had been capable of sophisticated planning, deception, and covering his tracks behaviors that indicated he understood his actions were wrong and illegal. The defendant may have been delusional about his relationships with these women, Kazemi argued, but he was not delusional about the illegality of stalking, kidnapping, and murder. He took elaborate precautions to avoid detection. He lied to police about his activities. He enlisted an accomplice to help dispose of evidence. These are not the actions of someone who believed he was engaged in legitimate, lawful behavior. The most compelling evidence came from the analysis of Rahmani's own journal entries and surveillance materials. While his delusions about romantic relationships were clearly documented, so was his understanding that his behavior needed to be hidden from law enforcement, and that his victims' families would be upset by their disappearances. In one particularly damaging entry, dated just weeks before Layla's murder, Rahmani had written, "Elle doesn't understand yet, but she will once we eliminate the distractions in her life. Have to be careful with timing, and location police are getting more suspicious about missing women. Need to make sure this one looks different from the others." This level of criminal sophistication, combined with his ability to maintain normal social relationships and hold down employment, undermined the defense's argument that his mental illness had completely impaired his judgment and moral reasoning. The trial's most dramatic moment came when Rahmani himself took the stand in his own defense. Against his attorney's advice, he insisted on testifying, believing that he could make the jury understand his perspective on the case. What followed was 2 hours of rambling, delusional testimony that ultimately sealed his fate. "I loved them all," Rahmani said, staring directly at the jury with an intensity that made several members visibly uncomfortable. Layla, especially. She was so beautiful, so talented. I could see that she was unhappy, trapped by family expectations and social pressure. I wanted to free her from all that, to show her what real love could be like. When prosecutor Kazemi cross-examined him, asking directly whether he understood that the women had not consented to his attention, Rahmani's response revealed the depth of his disconnection from reality. "Consent," he repeated, seeming genuinely confused by the question. "They all consented, through their actions, their looks, their choice to work in places where I could see them. When a woman makes herself beautiful and visible, she's sending a message. Maybe they couldn't say yes directly because of social pressure, but their hearts were saying yes. I could see it in their eyes." The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning with guilty verdicts on all charges. 7 counts of premeditated murder, multiple counts of kidnapping and stalking, and conspiracy charges related to his partnership with Ahmed Kakar. The mental health evaluations were acknowledged as mitigating factors during sentencing, but they did not absolve Rahmani of criminal responsibility for his actions. Judge Khorasani sentenced Rahmani to life in prison without the possibility of parole, noting that the systematic nature of his crimes and his continued delusions made him a permanent threat to public safety. In his remarks before imposing sentence, the judge addressed not only the defendant, but the broader community that had been traumatized by the case. The evidence in this case reveals crimes of extraordinary cruelty and calculated malice. Judge Khorasani said, his voice carrying the weight of months spent reviewing horrific evidence. While the court acknowledges the defendant's mental illness, it cannot excuse or diminish the suffering he has caused to his victims, their families, and the community at large. The systematic nature of these crimes, the vulnerability of the victims, and the defendant's complete lack of remorse require the harshest possible sentence under the law. The families of the victims had mixed reactions to the verdict and sentencing. While they were relieved that Rahmani would never again have the opportunity to harm other women, many struggled with the knowledge that his death in prison would not restore their lost loved ones or heal the trauma his actions had caused. "Justice has been served," said Laleh Nazari, speaking for his family outside the courthouse after sentencing. "But justice doesn't bring Laleh back. It doesn't take away the nightmares or fill the empty chair at our dinner table. We're grateful that this man can't hurt anyone else. But our real work now is learning how to live with what he's taken from us." The case's impact extended far beyond the criminal justice system. In the months following Rahmani's conviction, Tehrangrad implemented new policies for responding to stalking complaints, with specialized units trained to recognize patterns of escalating harassment. The city's police department established a database for tracking suspicious behavior across different precincts, ensuring that patterns like those exhibited by Rahmani and Kargar would be identified more quickly in the future. Educational campaigns in schools and workplaces taught people to recognize the warning signs of stalking and predatory behavior. The beauty industry developed new safety protocols, and many businesses installed improved security systems and surveillance cameras. Women's shelters reported increased funding and support as the community rallied to provide better resources for those experiencing harassment or domestic violence. But perhaps the most significant change was in the cultural conversation about women's safety and the responsibility of communities to protect vulnerable members. The case had demonstrated how easily predators could exploit social politeness and professional obligations, and how the failure to take seriously minor harassment complaints could escalate into tragedy. Dr. Zahra Amin, sociologist at Tehran University who studied the case's social impact, observed that it had fundamentally changed how many people thought about personal safety and community responsibility. The Laleh Nazari case showed us that violence against women isn't just about individual criminals. It's about systems and cultures that fail to take seriously the early warning signs of dangerous behavior, she explained. It forced us to confront uncomfortable questions about how we balance politeness and safety, and how we can better support women who feel threatened but may not have concrete evidence of danger. The case also sparked broader discussions about mental health resources and the need for better identification and treatment of individuals with severe personality disorders. While Rahmani's mental illness did not excuse his crimes, experts argued that earlier intervention might have prevented the escalation to violence. We need to develop better systems for identifying and treating individuals with severe delusional disorders before they become dangerous, explained Dr. Rastami during a conference on criminal psychology. This doesn't mean criminalizing mental illness, but it does mean taking seriously the warning signs when someone's delusions begin to focus on real people who could be harmed. As 2025 drew to a close, the physical markers of the case began to fade from public view. The courthouse, where Rahmani was tried, returned to its normal case. The search areas where investigators had looked for evidence were reclaimed by vegetation and new construction. Even Laleh's salon, which had remained empty since her disappearance, was eventually rented to a new business, a children's clothing store, whose bright decorations and cheerful atmosphere seemed to exorcise the sadness that had lingered in the space. But the emotional and psychological impact of the case continued to resonate through the lives of those it had touched. The families of the victims found themselves bound together by shared trauma and loss, forming support networks that would endure for years to come. They organized annual memorial services, scholarship funds, and awareness campaigns that kept their daughters' memories alive while working to prevent similar tragedies. Mariam Hossein, who had been Layla's assistant and closest friend, struggled for months with survivor's guilt and the question of whether she might have done something different to protect her friend. She eventually returned to work in the beauty industry, but she became an advocate for safety, training, and awareness programs that taught workers to recognize and respond to threatening behavior. I replayed that last week over and over in my mind, Mariam confided during a support group meeting for those affected by the case. I knew Laleh was scared about something, but I didn't push her to tell me what it was. I thought I was respecting her privacy, giving her space to handle whatever was bothering her. But maybe if I had been more insistent, if I had demanded to know what was wrong, the support group, organized by a local trauma counseling center, became a crucial resource for many people trying to process the complex emotions stirred up by the case. Participants included family members of victims, survivors who had encountered Rahmani during his stalking activities, law enforcement officers who had worked on the investigation, and community members who had been deeply affected by the crimes. Dr. Mitra Danishvar, the psychologist who facilitated the group, observed that the case had created a unique form of collective trauma that required specialized approaches to healing. When a crime like this happens in a community, it affects everyone's sense of safety and trust, she explained. People who never met Laleh or the other victims still felt personally threatened by what happened to them. They identified with the victims, imagined themselves or their loved ones in similar situations, and had to grapple with the realization that terrible things can happen to innocent people for no comprehensible reason. The investigation team also struggled with the psychological aftermath of the case. Detective Karimi, now Lieutenant Karimi, found that his promotion and recognition for solving the case felt hollow given the nature of what he had uncovered. The systematic cruelty of the crimes and the preventable nature of some of the deaths weighed heavily on his conscience. "We did our job," Karimi reflected during an interview marking the one-year anniversary of Laleh's disappearance. "We found the killers. We built a case that resulted in conviction. We potentially prevented future crimes. But I can't shake the feeling that we could have done more, sooner. Those women died while we were treating isolated harassment complaints as minor nuisances instead of recognizing them as part of a pattern." Captain Alizada, who had overseen the investigation's expansion into a serial killer case, used the experience to advocate for systemic changes in how law enforcement approached crimes against women. She developed training programs that taught officers to look for connections between seemingly unrelated incidents and to take seriously complaints that might seem trivial in isolation, but could represent escalating dangerous behavior. "The Ramana Kargar case taught us that we could afford to treat stalking and harassment as minor crimes," Alizada explained during a conference of law enforcement professionals. "What looks like annoying but harmless attention can be the early stage of something much more dangerous. We have to err on the side of taking these complaints seriously, even if most of them don't escalate to violence." The case also influenced legislative changes at the national level. Parliament passed stronger stalking laws that made it easier to prosecute harassment cases and provided better protection for victims. The new legislation included provisions for electronic monitoring of convicted stalkers, expanded definitions of threatening behavior, and resources for law enforcement agencies to share information across jurisdictional boundaries. But for many people affected by the case, the most meaningful changes were personal rather than institutional. Families became more open about discussing safety concerns. Women felt more empowered to report threatening behavior, even when they couldn't prove imminent danger. Communities developed informal networks for watching out for each other and sharing information about suspicious activities. Layla's parents, who had aged visibly during the months of uncertainty and investigation, found their own path toward healing through activism and remembrance. They established the Laleh Nazari Foundation, which provided safety training for women in small businesses and funded research into the prevention of stalking and harassment. "We can't bring Laleh back," Laleh Nazari said during the foundation's inaugural fundraising dinner, held on what would have been her daughter's 25th birthday. "But we can honor her memory by working to protect other young women who are building their dreams and their futures. If we can prevent even one other family from going through what we've experienced, then maybe Layla's death will have meant something." The foundation's work included funding for improved lighting in commercial districts, security camera systems for small businesses, and educational programs that taught people to recognize and respond to stalking behavior. They also provided financial support for victims of harassment who needed to relocate or take other safety precautions that could be financially difficult. Ali Nazari channeled his grief into woodworking projects that memorialized his daughter and the other victims. He created a beautiful memorial garden behind the family's neighborhood mosque, with handcrafted benches and planters that provided a peaceful space for reflection and remembrance. Each bench bore a small plaque with the name of one of the victims and a brief inscription about their dreams and aspirations. "Working with my hands helps me feel connected to Laleh," Ali explained to visitors who came to see the memorial garden. "She always loved watching me build things when she was little. She would sit in my workshop for hours, asking questions about the tools and the wood. I like to think that she would appreciate this place, that it would make her happy to know that people come here to remember her and the others." The memorial garden became a gathering place for the families of all the victims, a space where they could come together to share memories and support each other through the ongoing process of grief. On the anniversary of each victim's disappearance, small ceremonies were held, with family members reading poems, sharing photographs, and lighting candles in remembrance. These gatherings also served an important function in keeping the victims' stories alive in the community's collective memory. As media attention faded and new crises claimed public attention, there was a risk that the lessons of the case might be forgotten. but the continued presence of the families, their ongoing advocacy work, and the memorial garden ensured that the legacy of their lost daughters would endure. The case continued to influence academic research and professional training in fields ranging from criminal psychology to public safety. Dr. Rostami published several papers analyzing the psychological dynamics of the Romani-Kargar partnership, contributing to the scientific understanding of how certain types of mental illness can interact with criminal behavior. This case provides valuable insights into how delusional disorders can manifest in violent crime. Dr. Rostami wrote in a prestigious psychiatric journal, "The symbiotic relationship between the two perpetrators demonstrates how different pathologies can complement each other in dangerous ways, and how the combination of obsessive delusions with antisocial violence can create particularly deadly criminal partnerships." Police departments across the country began incorporating lessons from the case into their training programs. The systematic nature of the crimes and the way they had been hidden by legitimate business activities highlighted the need for better interagency, communication, and pattern recognition. The case became a standard example in courses on serial crime investigation and victim safety. International law enforcement agencies also studied the case as an example of how modern stalking crimes could exploit social media, professional networks, and legitimate business activities to facilitate victim selection and surveillance. The methods used by Romani and Kargar were unfortunately replicable in many different cultural and economic contexts, making their case relevant to investigators around the world. But perhaps the most enduring impact of the Laleh Nazari case was its effect on how ordinary people thought about safety, community responsibility, and the warning signs of dangerous behavior. The case had demonstrated that evil could hide behind professional credentials and social respectability, that deadly threats could masquerade as minor annoyances, and that the failure to take seriously women's concerns about their safety could have tragic consequences. Captain Alizadeh, who had overseen the investigation's most complex phases, continued to work with national law enforcement agencies to share the lessons learned from the case. She had become a recognized expert in serial stalking crimes and was frequently called upon to consult on similar cases in other jurisdictions. What we learned is that stalking isn't just a precursor to more serious crimes. It is a serious crime in itself, she explained during a training session for newly promoted detectives. The psychological impact on victims can be devastating, even when no physical violence occurs, and the escalation potential is always present, especially when the stalker's delusions become more elaborate or when external stressors trigger more aggressive behavior. The training materials she had developed included detailed analysis of the Romani-Kargar case, showing how the partnership had allowed the crimes to continue undetected for so long, the division of labor between the two men with Romani handling victim selection and surveillance, while Kargar managed the violent aspects and disposal of evidence had created a criminal enterprise that was more sophisticated and harder to detect than either man could have managed alone. This case taught us to look for patterns not just in individual behavior, but in collaborative criminal activity. Alizadeh continued, the fact that Romani had legitimate business reasons for being in various neighborhoods, combined with Kargar's willingness to use violence and his knowledge of remote disposal sites, created a perfect storm that allowed them to operate for years without detection. The psychological profiles developed during the case had also contributed to broader understanding of how mental illness could interact with criminal behavior. Dr. Rostami had published extensively about the case, always with careful attention to protecting the privacy of victims' families while sharing insights that could help prevent similar tragedies. The Romani case demonstrates that severe mental illness doesn't automatically excuse criminal behavior, but it can help us understand how to identify and intervene earlier. Dr. Rostami explained during a symposium on forensic psychiatry. His delusions were clear and well documented, but so was his understanding that his behavior needed to be concealed from authorities. This combination of mental illness with preserved criminal sophistication presents unique challenges for both treatment and public safety. The case had also influenced research into the effectiveness of various therapeutic interventions for individuals with erotomania and related delusional disorders. while Rahmani himself had shown little progress in treatment. His case provided valuable data about the persistence of certain types of delusions and the factors that might predict escalation to violence. Mental health professionals had developed new screening tools and treatment protocols based partly on insights from the case. These innovations were being implemented in clinical settings across the country, with the hope that future patients with similar symptoms could be identified and treated before their delusions led to harmful behavior. But beyond its impact on professional practices and systems, the Laleh Nazari case continued to resonate in the daily lives of ordinary people who had been touched by the story. Women throughout Tehrangrad and beyond reported feeling more empowered to trust their instincts about potentially threatening situations and more confident about seeking help when they felt unsafe. Shadi Rahimi, the hairdresser, who had experienced harassment similar to what Laleh had endured, became an advocate for workplace safety in the beauty industry. She developed training programs that taught salon workers and other service providers how to recognize concerning customer behavior and respond appropriately without jeopardizing their professional relationships or personal safety. Laleh's case taught us that being polite and professional doesn't mean we have to ignore our safety instincts. Shadi explained to a group of beauty school students during one of her presentations, "We can be welcoming to customers while still maintaining appropriate boundaries. We can be friendly without sharing personal information. And we can trust our feelings when something seems wrong, even if we can't articulate exactly what's bothering us." Her training materials included practical advice about documenting concerning interactions, communicating with coworkers about potential safety issues, and knowing when to contact law enforcement. The programs were implemented in beauty schools and professional development courses throughout the region, ensuring that new workers in the industry would be better prepared to protect themselves than Laleh and the other victims had been. The ripple effects of the case extended into unexpected areas of society. Urban planners began incorporating safety considerations more systematically into their designs for commercial districts, ensuring better lighting, more visible entrances and exits, and improved sightlines that would make it harder for predators to observe potential victims without being seen themselves. Business associations developed new guidelines for vendor relationships, requiring more thorough background checks and establishing clearer protocols for reporting concerning behavior by sales representatives or service providers. The cosmetics industry, in particular, implemented comprehensive reforms to prevent future exploitation of business relationships for criminal purposes. Educational institutions at all levels incorporated lessons from the case into their safety awareness programs. High schools and universities developed more sophisticated approaches to teaching students about personal safety, moving beyond simple warnings about stranger danger to provide nuanced understanding of how predators operated and how students could protect themselves and their peers. The traditional safety advice, "Don't walk alone at night, don't accept drinks from strangers," wasn't relevant to Laleh's situation, observed Dr. Sanaz Karimi, a safety education specialist who had redesigned curricula at several universities. She was killed by someone who used legitimate business interactions to gain access to her. We had to completely rethink how we teach people to recognize and respond to threats that do unfit the traditional profiles. The new educational approaches emphasize the importance of trusting instincts, communicating concerns to trusted friends or family members, and understanding that threats could come from people who seemed professional and respectable. Students learned to recognize the warning signs of stalking behavior and understand their options for seeking help, even when they were unsure whether they were in immediate danger. These educational efforts were supported by research showing that many victims of stalking and harassment had experienced warning signs or gut feelings that something was wrong, but had dismissed their concerns because they couldn't rationally justify them or because they feared overreacting. The Laleh Nazari case provided a powerful example of why these instincts should be taken seriously. As the years passed, the case continued to influence policy decisions at multiple levels of government. New legislation strengthened penalties for stalking and harassment, while also providing better resources for victims who needed protection. The laws recognized that stalking was often a precursor to more serious crimes and treated it accordingly, rather than dismissing it as a minor nuisance. Funding was allocated for improved coordination between different law enforcement agencies, ensuring that patterns of behavior could be identified even when they crossed jurisdictional boundaries. The databases and communication systems developed in response to the case became models for similar niche initiatives in other regions and countries. International law enforcement organizations studied the case as an example of how modern technology and social media could be exploited by criminals, but also how the same technologies could be used more effectively by investigators to identify patterns and track suspects. The investigative techniques developed during the case were shared with agencies around the world facing similar challenges. The victims' families remained at the center of these various initiatives, providing input and guidance to ensure that policy changes and educational programs reflected the real-world experiences of those who had been directly affected by stalking and harassment. Their continued advocacy ensured that the momentum for change generated by the case would not fade as public attention moved to other issues. Laleh Nazari, now in her late 50s, had found a new purpose in her advocacy work that helped channel her grief into meaningful action. The Laleh Nazari Foundation had grown from a small family initiative into a regional organization that provided services to dozens of families each year and influenced policy decisions throughout the country. "I can't save my own daughter," she said during a speech at the foundation's 5th annual fundraising dinner. "But maybe I can help save someone else's daughter. Every woman who feels more confident about reporting threatening behavior, every business that takes safety concerns more seriously, every police officer who recognizes warning signs earlier, they all represent a small victory against the forces that took Laleh from us." The Foundation's work had expanded beyond safety training and awareness to include research initiatives, victim support services, and memorial programs that honored not just Laleh, but all victims of stalking and harassment-related crimes. They had established scholarships for women pursuing careers in law enforcement, psychology, and related fields, ensuring that the next generation of professionals would be better prepared to address these challenges. Laleh Nazari continued his woodworking projects, creating memorial pieces that were displayed in schools, community centers, and government buildings throughout the region. His craftsmanship had evolved from a hobby into a form of artistic expression that told the story of loss, resilience, and hope. Each piece incorporated symbols and designs that reflected his daughter's personality and dreams, ensuring that her memory would remain alive in physical form long after those who knew her personally were gone. "Working with wood teaches you patience," Laleh reflected during an interview for a documentary about the families of crime victims. "You can't rush the process. The grain has to be respected. The natural patterns have to be followed. Grief is like that too. It has its own timeline, its own patterns. You can't force it to be something it's not, but you can shape it into something meaningful if you're patient and careful." His memorial garden had become a model for similar projects in other communities, demonstrating how spaces for reflection and remembrance could serve both as tributes to victims and as gathering places for survivors and advocates. The garden hosted regular events, memorial services, safety awareness workshops, community meetings that kept the lessons of the case alive in practical, actionable ways. The case's influence extended into the realm of art and culture, inspiring books, films, and other creative works that explored its themes of obsession, delusion, and the vulnerability of women in modern society. These artistic interpretations helped ensure that the story reached audiences beyond those directly involved in law enforcement or victim advocacy, spreading awareness to people who might not otherwise encounter these issues. A documentary film about the case won several awards at international film festivals, bringing global attention to the challenges faced by women in societies where traditional expectations of politeness and accommodation could be exploited by predators. The film was particularly effective in demonstrating how the victims had been ordinary people living normal lives, rather than individuals who had somehow invited or deserved the violence they experienced. What struck me about Laleh's story was how normal she was, explained the documentary's director, Laleh Nazari, during a Q&A session following a screening. She wasn't involved in anything dangerous or controversial. She was just a young woman trying to build a business and create a life for herself. That could be anyone's daughter, anyone's sister, anyone's friend. That's what makes this story so powerful and so frightening. The film's international distribution helped establish the case as an important example in discussions about gender-based violence, stalking prevention, and criminal justice reform. It was used in training programs for law enforcement agencies around the world and in academic courses studying crime, psychology, and social issues. As the 5th anniversary of Laleh's disappearance approached, the various institutions and initiatives that had grown out of the case had become permanent fixtures in the landscape of Tehrangrad and the surrounding region. The police protocols developed during the investigation were now standard practice. The educational programs inspired by the case were required components of safety training in schools and workplaces. The legislative changes prompted by the case had become the foundation for more comprehensive approaches to stalking prevention and victim protection. But perhaps the most significant legacy of the case was the change in social attitudes and expectations that it had helped to create. The story of Laleh Nazari and the other victims had become part of the collective consciousness of the community, a cautionary tale that informed how people thought about safety, vigilance, and mutual responsibility. Parents talked to their children differently about personal safety because of lessons learned from the case. Employers responded more seriously to harassment complaints because they understood the potential consequences of inaction. Communities developed better systems for watching out for each other because they had seen what could happen when warning signs were ignored or dismissed. The case changed how we think about the balance between individual privacy and collective safety, observed Dr. Amen, the sociologist who had studied its social impact over the years. People became more willing to report concerning behavior, even when they weren't certain it represented a genuine threat. They understood that the cost of false alarms was much lower than the cost of missed warnings. This cultural shift was evident in statistics showing increased reporting of stalking and harassment incidents, earlier intervention in cases that showed potential for escalation, and more successful prosecutions of crimes that might previously have been difficult to prove or prosecute. The systems and attitudes created in response to the Laleh Nazari case were preventing other tragedies from occurring, even though those prevented crimes would never be documented or celebrated. The men responsible for the original crimes had largely faded from public consciousness, as was appropriate. Behnam Rahmani remained in prison, where psychiatrists reported that his delusions persisted despite years of treatment and medication. He had been transferred to a facility specializing in the care of mentally ill inmates, where he spent his days in a controlled environment that provided safety for both him and society, while offering what treatment was possible for his condition. Omid Karga was dead, his body recovered from the burned cabin where he had made his final stand. In death, he had become a footnote to the larger story, remembered primarily as an example of how criminal partnerships could amplify the destructive potential of individual pathology. Neither man had achieved the notoriety or infamy that sometimes surrounded high-profile criminal cases. Instead, public attention had remained focused on their victims and on the positive changes that had emerged from the tragedy. This was a conscious choice by the media, the victims' families, and law enforcement officials, who understood that giving excessive attention to the perpetrators could inspire copycat crimes, or provide the kind of recognition that some criminals sought. "We chose to tell Laleh's story, not her killer story," explained Mariam Hossein during an interview marking the 5th anniversary. "We wanted people to remember her dreams, her talents, her love for her family and friends. We wanted her legacy to be about the positive changes that came from her death, not about the men who caused it." This approach had been successful in keeping the focus on prevention, healing, and positive change rather than on the sensational aspects of the crimes themselves. It demonstrated how communities could respond to tragedy in ways that honored victims while working constructively toward preventing future harm. On a quiet Tuesday morning in March 2030, exactly 5 years after Laleh Nazari had failed to open her salon for the last time, the memorial garden behind the neighborhood mosque was filled with people gathering for the anniversary remembrance ceremony. The crowd included the familiar faces of family members, investigators, and community leaders who attended every year, but also many new faces. Young people who had learned about the case and school professionals who had benefited from safety training programs, inspired by it, and community members who wanted to pay their respects to victims they had never known personally. The ceremony followed the same basic format as in previous years, with readings, musical performances, and brief speeches about the ongoing impact of the case. But this year included a special element: the dedication of a new educational center that would serve as a permanent hub for safety training, research, and victim support services. The Laleh Nazari Center for Women's Safety occupied a renovated building just 2 blocks from where her salon had once operated. The center housed training facilities for law enforcement and safety professionals, counseling services for victims of stalking and harassment, and educational programs for people of all ages. Its library contained the most comprehensive collection of resources on stalking prevention and victim support in the region. This center represents everything that Laleh's life stood for, said Laleh Nazari during the dedication ceremony. She believed in helping people feel beautiful and confident. She cared about building community connections. She dreamed of expanding her business and making a positive impact on the world around her. This center will do all of those things, and it will do them in her memory. The center's programs reflected the multifaceted lessons learned from the case. They included practical safety training that taught people how to recognize and respond to threatening behavior, but also broader educational initiatives that addressed the social and cultural factors that made certain individuals vulnerable to predatory behavior. Research conducted at the center focused on developing better methods for identifying and treating individuals with the kinds of psychological disorders that had driven Behnam Rahmani's criminal behavior. The goal was not to excuse or minimize the harm caused by such individuals, but to develop interventions that could prevent the development of dangerous obsessions before they led to violence. The center also served as a coordination hub for the various agencies and organizations that had developed new approaches to stalking prevention and victim support. It hosted regular conferences and training sessions that brought together law enforcement officials, mental health professionals, educators, and community leaders to share best practices and coordinate their efforts. As the dedication ceremony concluded and people began to tour the new facility, many visitors were struck by how the center managed to honor the victims while maintaining a forward-looking, optimistic atmosphere. The walls displayed photographs and brief biographies of Laleh and the other victims, but they were surrounded by information about prevention, programs, success stories from survivors, and testimonials from people whose lives had been improved by the various initiatives inspired by the case. "It feels like a place Laleh would have liked," observed Mariam Hossein as she walked through the center's main gallery, which featured rotating exhibits about safety awareness and community building. "It's beautiful and welcoming, but also practical and focused on helping people." That's exactly the kind of legacy she would have wanted. The center's opening marked a milestone in the long process of transforming tragedy into positive change, but it was not an ending. The staff and volunteers who would operate the center understood that their work was ongoing, that new challenges would emerge as society changed and as criminals found new ways to exploit technology and social relationships. They were committed to remaining vigilant and adaptive, learning from each new case and continually improving their approaches to prevention and support. The center would serve not just as a memorial to past victims, but as a bulwark against future tragedies. As evening fell over Tehrangrad on that 5th anniversary day, the city settled into its familiar rhythms of commerce and family life. In cafes and restaurants throughout the city, people discussed their work, their hopes, their plans for the future. young women walked confidently through streets that were better lit and more carefully monitored than they had been 5 years earlier. Salon workers and other service providers went about their business with improved training and better support systems to help them recognize and respond to potential threats. The changes were largely invisible to casual observers, embedded in systems and attitudes, rather than dramatic physical alterations to the urban landscape. But they represented a comprehensive transformation in how the community understood and addressed the challenges of keeping its members safe. Laleh Nazari had been dead for 5 years, her life cut short by forces she could never have fully understood or prepared for. But her legacy lived on in every woman who felt more confident about trusting her instincts. Every police officer who recognized warning signs earlier, every community that developed better systems for protecting its vulnerable members. Her story had become part of the larger human story about resilience, growth, and the capacity to create meaning from meaningless tragedy. It demonstrated that even the darkest crimes could not ultimately triumph over the human capacity for love, learning, and positive change. In death, Laleh had achieved a kind of immortality that her killers could never claim. She would be remembered not as a victim, but as a catalyst for changes that would protect countless other young women for generations to come. Her name would be spoken with respect and gratitude by people she had never met, in places she had never visited, long after the names of those who killed her had been forgotten. That, perhaps, was the truest justice of all. That love and hope had proven stronger than hatred and violence. That communities could heal and grow stronger even after experiencing profound trauma. And that the memory of one young woman's dreams and aspirations could inspire positive change that would endure far beyond the brief, brutal moment when those dreams were cut short. The story of Laleh Nazari was ultimately not a story about crime and punishment, but a story about the enduring power of human decency to triumph over evil and the capacity of communities to transform their darkest experiences into sources of light for future generations. In that transformation lay both her memorial and her victory. The Laleh Nazari Case, a crime documentary Part 3, Justice and Remembrance. The morning sun cast long shadows across the narrow streets of Tehran's Bazaar district, where the scent of cardamom and rosewater mingled with the exhaust fumes of countless motorcycles weaving through the early traffic. It was March 15, 2025, and the city of 8 million souls was stirring to life with its characteristic blend of ancient tradition and modern ambition. In this labyrinth of commerce and culture, where glass towers rose beside centuries-old caravanserais, a young woman named Laleh Nazari was about to become the center of a mystery that would grip the nation. Laleh's beauty sanctuary occupied the ground floor of a modest 3-story building on Shiraz Street, its pink neon sign flickering intermittently in the early morning light. The salon, with its gleaming white chairs and walls adorned with photographs of perfectly manicured nails, had become something of a neighborhood institution in the 2 years since Laleh had opened it. At 24, she possessed that rare combination of artistic talent and business acumen that had drawn clients from across the district, many of them young professionals who appreciated her meticulous attention to detail and warm, infectious laugh. The first sign that something was amiss came at exactly 9:17 a.m. when Mariam Hossein, Laleh's longtime assistant and closest friend, arrived to find the salon's security gate still locked. This was unusual. Laleh was notoriously punctual, often arriving before sunrise to prepare for her first appointments. Mariam stood on the sidewalk, her breath visible in the crisp morning air, pressing Laleh's number repeatedly on her phone. Each call went straight to voicemail, the cheerful recorded message now taking on an ominous quality. "Hi, this is Laleh. I can't take your call right now, but leave a message and I'll get back to you with beautiful nails." As the minutes ticked by, a small crowd began to gather. Mrs. Tabatabi, the elderly widow who ran the tea house next door, emerged with a steaming glass of chai, her weathered face creased with concern. "She was here yesterday evening," she told Mariam, her voice barely audible above the growing morning traffic. "I saw her locking up around 7. She seemed different." nervous, maybe. She kept looking over her shoulder. By 10:30 a.m., when Laleh's first appointment of the day, a bride-to-be named Shirin, who had been planning her nail design for weeks, arrived, to find the salon still closed, Maryam made the decision that would officially begin one of Tehrangrad's most perplexing missing person cases. She called the police. Detective Reza Karimi of the Tehrangrad Metropolitan Police had seen his share of missing person reports in his 15 years on the force. Most resolved themselves within 24 hours: family disputes, romantic escapades, or simple miscommunications. But as he stood outside Laleh's beauty sanctuary that afternoon, something about this case felt different. The methodical way Laleh had organized her appointment book, with detailed notes about each client's preferences and allergies. The fact that her purse was missing, but her car keys lay on the reception desk. The peculiar detail that Mrs. Tabatabai mentioned, how Laleh had seemed to be watching for someone. Karimi was a tall, lean man in his early 40s, with prematurely gray hair and a kind of patient demeanor that made people want to confide in him. He had grown up in a neighborhood not unlike this one, where everyone knew everyone else's business, and he understood the rhythms of community life. When someone like Laleh, reliable, visible, deeply connected to her neighbors, simply vanished, it sent ripples through the social fabric that couldn't be ignored. "Tell me about her routine," Karimi asked Maryam, as they sat in the salon, the afternoon light filtering through the frosted glass windows. Maryam was a petite woman with kind eyes that were now redrimmed from crying. She clutched a tissue in her hands, occasionally dabbing at her nose as she spoke. Laleh was like clockwork, Maryam explained, her voice slightly hoarse. Every morning, she'd arrive at 7:30. First thing, she'd make tea and check her supplies. Then, she'd review the day's appointments, making sure she had everything ready for each client. She was obsessive about preparation. It's what made her so good at what she did. Karimi nodded, making notes in a small leather-bound notebook. Did she mention any problems recently? Any clients who made her uncomfortable? Money issues? No, nothing like that. Business was good, better than ever. Actually, she was even talking about expanding, maybe opening a second location in the university district. Maryam paused, seeming to search her memory for something significant. Although, there was something. About 2 weeks ago, she started acting strange, more cautious. She installed a new lock on the back door and asked me to always make sure we locked up together. When I asked her about it, she just said she'd had some unwanted attention from someone, but she wouldn't elaborate. This detail caught Karimi's attention. In his experience, when young women spoke about unwanted attention, it usually pointed to stalking or harassment situations that could escalate unpredictably. He made a note to check if Laleh had filed any reports or sought a restraining order. The investigation's first major development came 3 days later, when Laleh's white Peugeot 206 was discovered in the parking lot of Mellet Park, one of Tehrangrad's largest green spaces. The car was unlocked, with Laleh's phone lying on the passenger seat, its battery completely drained. More puzzling was what wasn't there. Her purse, which Maryam insisted she always carried, was nowhere to be found. Detective Farhad Mohajer, Karimi's partner and the department's specialist in forensic evidence, carefully processed the vehicle, while a crowd of onlookers gathered behind the police tape. Mohajer was younger than Karimi, in his mid-30s, with a methodical approach to evidence gathering that had solved numerous cases over the years. He had a particular talent for finding details that others missed, a skill that would prove crucial in the days ahead. No signs of struggle inside the car, Mohajer reported as he dusted the interior for fingerprints. But look at this. He pointed to the driver's seat, which was positioned much further back than would be comfortable for someone of Laleh's small stature. Either she adjusted this before getting out, or someone else drove the car here. The park itself presented a frustrating maze of possibilities. Mellet Park sprawled across 40 hectares of rolling hills and artificial lakes, with dozens of walking paths, hidden groves, and secluded picnic areas. On any given day, thousands of people pass through its gates, families with children, young couples seeking privacy, elderly men playing backgammon under the plane trees, joggers and cyclists pursuing their fitness routines. Finding witnesses who might have seen Laleh or her car arriving in the parking lot seemed like an impossible task. But Karimi had learned that impossible tasks often yielded to patience and systematic effort. He and Mohajer began the painstaking process of interviewing park security guards, groundskeepers, and regular visitors. They studied hours of security camera footage from the main entrances, looking for any sign of the white Peugeot or its occupants. Meanwhile, the media had caught wind of the story. Laleh's disappearance first appeared as a brief item in the local news, but within days it had captured the attention of national television. There was something about the case that resonated with the public. Perhaps it was Laleh's youth and obvious warmth, visible in the photographs her family had provided to the police. Or maybe it was the mystery itself, the complete absence of obvious motive or explanation. Laleh Nazari, Laleh's mother, became the face of the family's anguish. A dignified woman in her 50s who worked as a teacher at a local elementary school. She appeared on television with her husband, Ali, a carpenter, pleading for information about their daughter's whereabouts. Their apartment, located in a working-class neighborhood about 20 minutes from the salon, became a gathering place for relatives and friends who took turns manning phones and coordinating search efforts. "She's my only daughter," Sediga said during one particularly emotional television interview, her voice breaking as she held a framed photograph of Laleh. "She lights up every room she enters. People are drawn to her kindness, her talent. Someone out there knows something. Please, I'm begging you, help us bring her home." The family's vigil was both heartbreaking and inspiring. Laleh's cousins organized search parties that combed through every corner of Mellet Park and the surrounding areas. Her former classmates from beauty school created social media campaigns that spread across the internet, sharing Laleh's photograph and details about her disappearance. Local business owners offered rewards for information, and prayer groups met regularly at the neighborhood mosque, asking for divine intervention in finding the missing young woman. As the investigation entered its second week, Karimi found himself developing what he privately called his Laleh theory, a growing conviction that this was not a random crime or a simple case of someone choosing to disappear. The evidence, while sparse, pointed to something more sinister: the careful positioning of the car seat, the missing purse, while less valuable items remained untouched. The fact that Laleh had recently become more security-conscious. Most telling of all was what he had learned about Laleh's character from dozens of interviews with people who knew her. "She wasn't the type to just leave," Karimi explained to his supervisor, Captain Masan Rahimi, during one of their daily briefings. "Everyone describes her the same way: responsible, family-oriented, passionate about her business. She was planning a family dinner for her father's birthday next week. She had appointments scheduled out for the next month. Everything about her life suggests someone who was planning for the future, not running from the past." Captain Rahimi, a veteran officer nearing retirement, had seen enough cases to know that people could surprise you, but he respected Karimi's instincts. "What are you thinking? Abduction? Possibly. Or she discovered something she shouldn't have. Maybe saw something, overheard something. We're checking all her recent clients, but that's a long list." She was popular. The client interviews proved to be both illuminating and frustrating. Laleh's appointment book revealed a diverse clientele that included university students, young mothers, office workers, and even a few local celebrities who appreciated her discretion and skill. Almost without exception, they described her as professional, friendly, and trustworthy. Someone who remembered personal details about their lives and always made them feel welcome. But among the dozens of glowing testimonials, a few anomalies emerged. 3 different clients mentioned that during their most recent appointments, Laleh had seemed distracted, occasionally pausing in her work to listen to sounds from the street or glancing frequently toward the salon's front window. One client, a lawyer named Nasturan Ahmed, recalled a particularly strange moment during her appointment on March 10th, just 5 days before Laleh's disappearance. "She was working on my nails when this black car pulled up outside," Ahmed told Karimi during her interview. Not unusual people park there all the time for the other businesses on the street, but Laleh just froze when she saw it. She went completely pale and actually dropped her nail file. "When I asked if she was okay, she said she was fine, but I could tell she wasn't." She kept watching that car until it drove away about 10 minutes later. This detail aligned with Mrs. Tabatabai's observation about Laleh appearing nervous in her final days at the salon. Karimi added it to his growing list of questions. Who had been watching Laleh? Why had she felt threatened? And most importantly, where was she now? The break in the case came from an unexpected source. Hazen Marathi was a night security guard at a construction site about half a mile from Mellet Park. He worked the midnight 2-8 shift, spending most of his time reading or listening to radio programs to stay awake. On the night of March 14th, the last time anyone had seen Laleh, had been dealing with a persistent group of teenagers who kept trying to sneak onto the construction site to spray graffiti. I was chasing them off for the third time that night when I saw this car speeding down Valiezer Avenue, Marathi told Karimi when he finally came forward, nearly 2 weeks after Laleh's disappearance. It was going way too fast for that time of night. What caught my attention was that it nearly hit a taxi that was trying to make a turn. Marathi described the car as dark-colored, possibly a sedan, but admitted he hadn't gotten a good look at it. However, he had noted the time, 2:47 a.m., according to the digital clock on his radio. This timing was significant because the medical examiner's initial assessment, when Laleh's case became a potential homicide investigation, suggested that if something had happened to her, it likely occurred in the early morning hours of March 15th. But Marathi's most valuable contribution to the investigation came from what he observed about 20 minutes later. As he was completing his logbook entries for the night, he noticed a figure walking along the pedestrian path that bordered the construction site. The person was moving slowly, almost hesitantly, and kept looking back over their shoulder. It was too dark to make out details, but something about the way they were walking seemed off. Marathi explained, like they were hurt, or scared, or both. They were staying in the shadows, avoiding the streetlights. I almost called out to see if they needed help, but then they disappeared into the park area. The pedestrian path Marathi had observed led directly to Mellet Park, specifically to a section near where Laleh's car would later be found. This potential sighting, combined with the timeline suggested by the speeding vehicle, began to paint a picture of that crucial night, though many pieces of the puzzle remained frustratingly absent. As March gave way to April, the investigation expanded to include digital forensics specialists who began the painstaking process of recovering data from Laleh's phone. The device had been exposed to moisture during its time in the car, and much of its memory was corrupted, but they managed to retrieve fragments of her recent communications. What they found added another layer of complexity to the case. In the weeks leading up to her disappearance, Laleh had been receiving text messages from an unknown number. The messages themselves were innocuous comments about her work, compliments on her skills, questions about appointment availability, but their frequency was concerning. The unknown sender had contacted her almost daily, sometimes multiple times per day, and Laleh had never responded to any of these messages. Even more troubling was a partially recovered text message from March 12th, 3 days before her disappearance. The message was incomplete due to data corruption, but what remained was chilling. See you soon, beautiful. You can't avoid me forever. We have so much to... Dr. Mitra Hosseini, the police department's forensic technology specialist, worked for days trying to recover the rest of that message and identify its sender. The phone number appeared to be from a prepaid mobile service, making it nearly impossible to trace to a specific individual without additional evidence. Whoever sent these messages was careful. Dr. Hosseini explained to the investigative team during one of their weekly briefings. They used a service that doesn't require identification for purchase. The phone was likely bought with cash and activated using false information. This suggests premeditation, not impulsive behavior. The pattern of harassment revealed in Laleh's phone records prompted Karimi to expand his investigation to include other young women in the beauty industry. Working with colleagues from adjacent precincts, he began looking for similar cases: missing persons, harassment complaints, or unexplained incidents involving women who worked in salons, spas, or similar businesses. What he discovered was disturbing. Over the past 18 months, 5 other young women in beauty-related professions had reported incidents of stalking or harassment in the greater Tehrangrad area. 2 had received anonymous gifts left at their workplaces. 1 had reported a man following her home from work on multiple occasions. Another had found disturbing photographs of herself slipped under her apartment door, photos that could only have been taken by someone who had been watching her for weeks. Most unsettling of all was the case of Laleh Nazari, a 22-year-old makeup artist who worked at a department store cosmetics counter in the upscale Gateway district. 3 months before Laleh's disappearance, Zara had reported receiving anonymous letters and phone calls from someone claiming to be a client interested in her services. When she agreed to meet the supposed client at a coffee shop, no one had shown up. But over the following weeks, she continued to receive messages indicating that someone was watching her daily routine. He knew things he shouldn't have known. Zara told Karimi during their interview, "What time I got to work, what I wore, who I talked to during my breaks. It was like having a ghost following me around. I reported it to the police, but there wasn't much they could do without more concrete evidence." Zara's case had eventually faded away when the harassment stopped as abruptly as it had begun. But now, in light of Laleh's disappearance, it took on new significance. Karimi began to wonder if they were dealing with a serial predator, someone who targeted women in the beauty industry, studying their routines and vulnerabilities before making his move. The theory gained additional support when Karimi interviewed Shadi Rahimi, a hairdresser who worked in a salon about 3 miles from Laleh's location. Shadi had never reported her experience to police, dismissing it as merely creepy rather than threatening. But her story was remarkably similar to the others. "It started about 6 months ago," Shadi explained, unconsciously wrapping her arms around herself as she spoke. "I kept noticing this man in the coffee shop across from our salon. Different man each time, but there was something about the way they watched our front door that felt wrong. My boss thought I was being paranoid, but then I started receiving flowers at work, beautiful arrangements, expensive ones, but no card, no name. When I asked the delivery companies who was sending them, they all said the same thing: cash payment, no customer information." The pattern was becoming clear, and it was far more sophisticated than Karimi had initially imagined. This wasn't a simple case of an obsessed individual fixating on one woman. Instead, they appeared to be dealing with someone who systematically targeted multiple women, studying their habits and routines before escalating his attention to more direct contact. But where was Laleh? As April progressed with no sign of her, the investigation began to shift from missing person to probable homicide. This transition was painful for everyone involved, especially Laleh's family, who had maintained hope that she would somehow return safely. The change in status brought additional resources to the case. Detective Captain Sarah Alizada, the department's specialist in violent crimes against women, joined the investigation team. Alizada was known throughout the department for her analytical approach and her ability to think like the criminals she pursued. She had solved several high-profile cases involving serial predators, and her presence signaled that the department was taking the case seriously. "Let's assume our theory is correct," Alizada said during her first meeting with Karimi and Mohajer. "We have someone who targets women in beauty-related professions. He studies them, learns their routines, and then makes contact through seemingly innocent means: texts, messages, flowers, fake appointment requests. But what's his endgame? What does he want from these women?" This question would drive the investigation for the next several weeks. The team began mapping out the known cases, looking for geographical patterns, timing correlations, and any other connections that might reveal the perpetrator's identity or predict his next move. The geographical analysis revealed that all the incidents had occurred within a roughly 20-mile radius centered on downtown Tehrangrad. The timing showed a clear escalation. The frequency of incidents had increased dramatically over the past year, and the level of intrusion had become more personal and threatening. Most concerning of all was the realization that Laleh appeared to represent a significant escalation in the perpetrator's behavior. While the other victims had been harassed and frightened, none had actually vanished. Whatever had happened to Laleh marked a dangerous new phase in the criminal's pattern. as the investigation team worked to build their profile of the suspected perpetrator. They also faced the challenge of keeping the community informed without causing panic. The media attention surrounding Laleh's case had already put many local businesses on edge, and several salon owners had reported decreased foot traffic as clients became nervous about their safety. Mayor Laleh Nazari held a press conference on April 18th, exactly 1 month after Laleh's disappearance, to address public concerns and announce increased police patrols in commercial districts where beauty businesses were concentrated. Standing beside Detective Karimi and Captain Alizada, the mayor attempted to strike a balance between acknowledging the seriousness of the situation and maintaining public confidence. We want to assure the citizens of Tehrangrad that their safety is our highest priority, Mayor Nazari declared, his voice carrying across the packed auditorium. While we cannot discuss all the details of this ongoing investigation, I can tell you that our police department is working tirelessly to find Laleh Nazari and ensure that whoever is responsible for her disappearance is brought to justice. Behind the scenes, however, the investigation was facing mounting pressure from multiple directions. The mayor's office wanted results that would restore public confidence. The media demanded regular updates and access to information. Most importantly, Laleh's family needed answers about what had happened to their daughter. Laleh Nazari had aged visibly in the weeks since her daughter's disappearance. The vibrant educator, who had initially appeared on television with hope and determination, now moved through her days with the mechanical precision of someone running on willpower alone. She continued to coordinate search efforts and maintain the family's social media presence, but those closest to her could see the toll the uncertainty was taking. "I keep expecting her to call," Sedegay confided to Karimi during one of his regular check-ins with the family. "Every time the phone rings, every time there's a knock at the door, part of me thinks it's going to be her. She has some explanation for where she's been, and we'll laugh about how worried we all were." The family had established a routine that was both heartbreaking and inspiring. Every evening, they gathered in Laleh's childhood bedroom, which remained exactly as she had left it when she moved to her own apartment 2 years earlier. Her teenage diary still sat on the nightstand, alongside photographs of her with school friends, and a small collection of nail polish bottles from her early experiments with the art that would become her career. Ali Nazari, Laleh's father, had taken leave from his carpentry work to dedicate himself full-time to the search effort. A quiet man who typically preferred to express himself through his craftsmanship rather than words. He channeled his grief into action. He printed thousands of flyers with Laleh's photograph and contact information, distributing them to every business, mosque, and community center in the city. He organized volunteer search teams that methodically combed through areas the police had already investigated, driven by a father's refusal to accept that his daughter might be gone forever. "She's out there somewhere," Ali would tell anyone who would listen, his weathered hands clutching one of the flyers. "My Laleh is strong. She's a survivor. We just have to find her." The family's determination inspired a grassroots movement that extended far beyond their immediate community. Social media campaigns with hashtags like #FindLaleh and #BringHerHome spread across platforms, shared by thousands of people who had never met her but felt connected to her story. Local artists created murals featuring her portrait. Musicians wrote songs inspired by her disappearance. The case had transcended its origins as a police investigation to become a symbol of communal hope and determination. But as April gave way to May, the harsh reality of criminal investigations began to assert itself. Despite the extensive publicity, the volunteer search efforts, and the dedicated work of the police team, no significant new evidence had emerged. The digital forensics had yielded no additional information from Laleh's phone. The interviews with potential witnesses had produced no reliable sightings of her. After March 14th, the surveillance camera footage from businesses throughout the city had been reviewed multiple times without revealing any trace of her movements on the night she disappeared. Detective Alizada made the difficult decision to expand the investigation's scope once again, this time focusing on the possibility that Laleh's remains might be located in one of the many construction sites. abandoned buildings, or remote areas surrounding Tehrangrad. This phase of the investigation required specialized equipment and expertise, including cadaver-detecting dogs and ground-penetrating radar systems. The search teams began with locations that matched the geographical profile they had developed, areas that were secluded enough for someone to dispose of evidence without being observed, but accessible enough that they wouldn't require specialized vehicles or equipment to reach. They focused particularly on sites within a reasonable driving distance of Mellet Park, working on the theory that whoever had driven Laleh's car there might have chosen a nearby location for whatever had happened to her. On May 12th, nearly 2 months after Laleh's disappearance, the search teams made their first significant discovery. Hidden in a grove of trees about 3 miles from Mellet Park, they found a woman's purse partially buried under a pile of leaves and debris. The purse was expensive leather, dark brown with distinctive silver hardware, and it matched exactly the description Mariam had provided of the bag Laleh typically carried. Inside the purse, investigators found Laleh's identification cards, credit cards, and about $200 in cash, eliminating robbery as a motive for her disappearance. More importantly, they found her appointment book, a small leather-bound planner, where she meticulously recorded not just client information, but also personal notes and observations. Dr. Hossein and her forensics team spent days analyzing every page of the appointment book, looking for clues about Laleh's state of mind in the days leading up to her disappearance. What they found painted a picture of someone who had been increasingly concerned about her safety, but who had tried to maintain normalcy in her daily routine. In entries dated just a week before her disappearance, Laleh had written cryptic notes that suggested she was aware of being watched. Same car again, today black sedan, tinted windows, parked across street during lunch, and 2 days later, asked Mariam to walk me to car after work. Didn't want to worry her with details. Most chilling of all was an entry from March 13th. Her final day of recorded thoughts. Who won't shake the feeling that something bad is going to happen? Called Mama tonight just to hear her voice. If anything happens to me, I want her to know how much I love her and how grateful I am for everything she has done for me. The discovery of the purse marked a turning point in both the investigation and the public's perception of the case. The family's hope, while never completely extinguished, began to evolve into a different kind of determination. The need to understand what had happened to Laleh and ensure that justice was served. The forensics team's analysis of the purse and its location provided several important clues. The way it had been buried suggested someone familiar with the area. The spot was hidden from casual view, but accessible via a network of informal walking trails used by local residents for exercise and recreation. Soil analysis indicated the purse had been there for several weeks, consistent with the timeline of Laleh's disappearance. Perhaps most significantly, the forensics team found trace evidence on the purse that didn't belong to Laleh. Several fibers that appeared to be from men's clothing were embedded in the leather, and partial fingerprints on the metal hardware didn't match Laleh's or any of her known associates. "This is the break we've been waiting for," Alizada explained to the investigation team during their daily briefing. "Whoever handled this purse left us evidence. Now we need to find him." The fingerprint analysis became the investigation's top priority. The partial prints were run through every database available to law enforcement: criminal records, employment files for jobs requiring security clearances, military service records. The process was painstaking, requiring expert technicians to compare hundreds of potential matches against the limited print data recovered from the purse. While they waited for results from the fingerprint analysis, the investigation team continued to pursue other leads. The fiber evidence suggested that whoever had handled the purse was wearing a dark wool blend fabric, possibly from a suit or formal jacket. This detail, while seemingly minor, added to their growing profile of the perpetrator, someone who might work in a professional environment where formal attire was expected. The team also expanded their canvas of the area where the purse was found, interviewing residents of nearby neighborhoods and employees of businesses in the vicinity. This effort yielded another potentially significant lead: a security camera at a gas station about half a mile from the discovery site had recorded a dark sedan stopping for fuel at 3:23 a.m. on March 15th, just hours after the estimated time of Laleh's disappearance. The camera angle wasn't ideal, and the image quality was poor due to the early morning darkness. But digital enhancement specialists were able to extract some useful information. The vehicle appeared to be a late-model sedan, possibly a Toyota Camry or Honda Accord, with tinted windows and what looked like damage to the front bumper. Most importantly, they were able to partially reconstruct the license plate number. With this new evidence, the investigation team began the process of tracking down every vehicle that matched their description and partial plate information. This required coordination with the motor vehicle department and cross-referencing against insurance records. But it represented their best hope of identifying the person who might have been involved in Laleh's disappearance. As May progressed, the case took on an increasingly urgent tone. The discovery of Laleh's purse had confirmed that something serious had happened to her, and the physical evidence suggested they were dealing with someone who had experience covering their tracks. The investigation team worried that if this person had indeed targeted other women in the past, Laleh might not be his only victim. Captain Alizada made the decision to go public with some of the information they had gathered, hoping to generate additional leads from the community. At a press conference on May 20th, she released a composite sketch of the suspected vehicle and appealed directly to anyone who might have information about its owner or whereabouts. We believe this vehicle was in the area of Mellet Park and the surrounding neighborhoods during the early morning hours of March 15th, Alizada announced, holding up an enlarged photograph of the enhanced surveillance image. If you saw this car, if you know who owns it, or if you have any information that might help us identify its driver, please contact our investigation team immediately. The response to the press conference was immediate and overwhelming. The police department's tip line received more than 300 calls in the first 24 hours, with reports of similar vehicles from all across the city. Each call required investigation, and the team found themselves working around the clock to sort through potential leads and eliminate false information. Among the calls, however, several stood out as particularly promising. 3 different citizens reported seeing a dark sedan matching the description parked in unusual locations during the weeks leading up to Laleh's disappearance, once outside a beauty school in the University District, once near a spa in the wealthy Laleh neighborhood, and once in the parking lot of a shopping center that housed several salons and cosmetic stores. These sightings supported the team's theory that they were dealing with someone who systematically targeted women in the beauty industry. The locations formed a geographical pattern that encompassed most of the previous harassment cases they had identified, suggesting that the same individual might be responsible for all of them. The breakthrough came on May 25th, when the fingerprint analysis finally yielded a match. The partial prints recovered from Laleh's purse belonged to a 34-year-old man named Behnam Rahmani, who worked as a sales representative for a cosmetics distribution company. Rahmani's fingerprints were on file because he had applied for a security clearance as part of a previous job with a government contractor. Detective Karimi felt a surge of adrenaline as he reviewed Rahmani's file. The man's job would have given him legitimate reasons to visit beauty salons and spas throughout the city, providing perfect cover for surveillance activities. His work schedule would have allowed him flexible hours and the freedom to move around different neighborhoods without attracting attention. Even more significantly, Rahmani owned a dark blue Honda Accord that matched both the general description and the partial license plate number recovered from the gas station surveillance footage. The vehicle registration showed that he had reported minor front-end damage to his insurance company just 2 weeks after Laleh's disappearance. Damage, he claimed, had occurred when he struck a pothole, but which could just as easily have resulted from some other kind of collision. "This is our guy," Karimi told Alizada, as they prepared to obtain a search warrant for Rahmani's apartment and vehicle. "Everything fits: the job, the car, the timeline. And now we have physical evidence linking him to Laleh's purse." The search warrant was executed at dawn on May 27, exactly 73 days after Laleh Nazari had last been seen alive. Behnam Rahmani was arrested at his apartment in the middle-class Satar Khan neighborhood a modest two-bedroom unit that he had rented for the past 3 years. His initial reaction to the arrest was confusion, claiming he had no idea why police were at his door. But seasoned investigators like Karimi had seen such performances before. The search of Romani's apartment revealed a disturbing collection of evidence that painted a picture of a man obsessed with women in the beauty industry. Hidden in a closet, investigators found hundreds of photographs of women taken without their knowledge, images captured through salon windows, pictures of women walking to and from work, close-up shots taken with telephoto lenses. Many of the photos were of women they had already identified as harassment victims, including several clear images of Laleh both inside her salon and walking on the street outside. Even more disturbing was a detailed journal that Romani had kept, documenting his surveillance activities and his increasingly obsessive thoughts about his targets. The journal entries revealed a man who had convinced himself that the women he was watching were somehow communicating with him, responding to his attention, even though they were completely unaware of his existence. In an entry dated March 10th, just 5 days before Laleh's disappearance, Romani had written, "L is playing hard to get, but I can tell she's interested. She keeps looking out the window when I drive by. Today she even smiled when she saw my car. I think she's ready for our relationship to move to the next level." The investigation team realized they were dealing with someone who had lost touch with reality, who had constructed an elaborate fantasy world in which his stalking behavior was actually a form of courtship. But as they delved deeper into Romani's disturbing world, they were about to discover that the case was far more complex than they had imagined. The interrogation room at the Tehrangrad Metropolitan Police Headquarters was a windowless box painted in institutional beige, designed to be as psychologically uncomfortable as possible. Detective Karimi sat across from Behnam Romani, studying the man who had consumed his thoughts for the past 2 months. Romani was smaller than Karimi had expected, perhaps 5 feet 8 inches tall, with thinning black hair and nervous eyes that darted constantly around the room. He wore an expensive suit that seemed too large for his frame, as if he were trying to project an image of success and confidence that didn't match his actual demeanor. "Tell me about Laleh Nazari," Karimi began, his voice deliberately calm and conversational. He had learned over the years that suspects often revealed more when they didn't feel immediately threatened. Romani's reaction was immediate and telling. His eyes widened slightly, and he shifted in his chair, but he maintained his facade of confusion. "I don't know anyone by that name. I think there's been some kind of mistake." "Really?" Karimi opened the file folder he had brought with him and spread several photographs across the table. They were surveillance images from Romani's own collection, showing Laleh at work, walking down the street, and sitting in her car. "Because you seem to know her quite well." For a moment, Romani's carefully constructed mask slipped. Karimi saw something flash across his face, not guilt or fear, but possessiveness. It was the look of a man seeing photographs of something he believed belonged to him. "Those aren't mine," Romani said weakly, but his voice lacked conviction. "Anyone could have taken those pictures." Karimi leaned forward slightly, maintaining eye contact. "Behnam, we found these photographs in your apartment, along with detailed notes about Laleh's daily routine, her work schedule, even her family members. We have your fingerprints on her purse. Your car was seen in the area where she disappeared. I think it's time you told me what really happened." The interrogation continued for 6 hours, with Romani alternating between denying any knowledge of Laleh and making increasingly bizarre claims about their relationship. According to his version of events, Laleh had been sending him signals for months, encouraging his attention through subtle gestures and meaningful glances. He claimed that she had deliberately positioned herself where he could see her, that she had chosen her outfits to appeal to him, that her smiles were meant specifically for him. "She wanted me to notice her," Romani insisted during one particularly disturbing segment of the interrogation. "Women like that, they play games. They want you to pursue them, to show them how much you care. Laleh was testing me, seeing how far I would go to prove my love." Detective Alizada, who had been observing the interrogation from the adjacent room, felt a chill as she listened to Romani's delusional explanations. She had encountered similar cases before, but the depth of his disconnection from reality was particularly disturbing. More concerning was what he wasn't saying, despite hours of questioning. He had provided no information about what had actually happened to Laleh on the night of March 14th. As the interrogation progressed, Rahmani's story began to shift and evolve in troubling ways. He started to admit that he had been watching Laleh, but claimed it was because he was concerned for her safety. He said he had noticed other men paying attention to her and had appointed himself as her unofficial protector. When pressed for details about these other men, however, his descriptions were vague and contradictory. There was this guy in a red car who kept driving by her salon, Rahmani claimed at one point, and someone else, older man, who would stand across the street pretending to read a newspaper. I was watching out for her, keeping her safe from the real dangerous people. This new narrative raised disturbing questions for the investigation team. Was Rahmani telling the truth about other potential stalkers, or was this simply another layer of his delusional thinking? Given the systematic nature of his surveillance and the evidence of his obsession, it seemed unlikely that he was genuinely concerned for Laylah's welfare. But the possibility that there might be other individuals involved in the case could not be completely dismissed. Dr. Amir Rostami, a forensic psychiatrist who had been called in to evaluate Rahmani's mental state, spent several hours interviewing the suspect. His preliminary assessment painted a picture of a man with severe personality disorders and a dangerous detachment from reality. Mr. Rahmani exhibits classic signs of erotomania. Dr. Rostami explained to the investigation team, "This is a delusional disorder in which the patient believes that another person, typically someone of higher social status, is in love with them. The delusion is fixed and resistant to contradictory evidence." In Rahmani's mind, every interaction with Laleh, no matter how minimal or one-sided, was confirmation of their mutual romantic connection. But Dr. Rostami also noted something else troubling in his evaluation. While erotomania can explain his stalking behavior and his delusional beliefs about their relationship, it doesn't typically lead to violence against the object of the delusion. Patients with this disorder usually see themselves as protecting and cherishing their imagined partner. If Rahmani was responsible for harming Laleh, there may be additional psychological factors at play. This assessment forced the investigation team to consider uncomfortable possibilities. If Rahmani's delusions had led him to believe that Laleh was in danger from others, might he have taken actions he believed were protective but were actually harmful? Or had something happened to shatter his delusions, causing him to lash out in rage when reality conflicted with his fantasy world? Meanwhile, the forensic analysis of Rahmani's vehicle and apartment continued to yield disturbing evidence. Hidden in his car's trunk, investigators found a collection of items that appeared to be trophies or mementos from his surveillance activities, a napkin from the cafe where Laleh sometimes had lunch, a receipt that had blown from her purse in the parking lot, even a small piece of fabric that appeared to have been torn from one of her scarves. In his apartment, they discovered what could only be described as a shrine dedicated to Laleh. One entire wall of his bedroom was covered with photographs of her, arranged in a careful chronological order that documented his growing obsession. Interspersed among the photos were printed copies of her social media posts, articles about her salon from local newspapers, and even copies of business permits and licensing documents he had somehow obtained. Most disturbing of all was a detailed floor plan of Laleh's apartment building, complete with notes about security measures, exit routes, and the daily routines of other residents. The level of planning and preparation evident in these materials suggested that Rahmani had been contemplating some kind of direct action for weeks or even months before Laleh's disappearance. But despite this overwhelming evidence of obsession and premeditation, Rahmani continued to deny any involvement in Laleh's disappearance. As May turned into June, the investigation team found themselves in the frustrating position of having identified their primary suspect, but being unable to determine what had actually happened to Laleh, or where she might be found. The media attention surrounding Rahmani's arrest was intense and often problematic. Within hours of the news breaking, reporters had gathered outside his apartment building, interviewing neighbors and co-workers who expressed shock at the revelations about his secret life. His employer, Aria Cosmetics Distribution, issued a statement distancing themselves from his actions and announcing a comprehensive review of their hiring and supervision practices. "We are horrified to learn about the allegations against Mr. Rahmani," the company's statement read. "While he was known to us as a dedicated employee with an excellent sales record, we had no knowledge of his personal activities or the disturbing behavior described by law enforcement. We are cooperating fully with the police investigation and have implemented additional security measures to protect our employees and clients." The revelation that Rahmani had used his legitimate business access to various beauty salons and spas as cover for his stalking activities sent shockwaves through the industry. Many salon owners began questioning whether other sales representatives or service providers might have been using their access inappropriately. Some establishments installed additional security cameras or changed their policies about allowing vendors to spend extended time in their businesses. Laleh's family, while relieved that a suspect had been arrested, found little comfort in the development. The discovery of the photographs and surveillance materials only emphasized how violated Laleh must have felt in her final weeks, knowing that someone was watching her, but not understanding the true extent of the threat she faced. "To know that this man was following my daughter, taking pictures of her, planning God knows what," Laleh Nazari said during a tearful interview outside the courthouse where Rahmani was being held. "It makes me sick to think about how scared she must have been, and we still don't know where she is or what happened to her." The family's anguish was compounded by the realization that despite the arrest, the fundamental questions about Laleh's fate remained unanswered. Rahmani's continued denials meant that they were no closer to finding her or understanding the circumstances of her disappearance. As June progressed, the investigation team faced mounting pressure to produce results. The mayor's office was fielding calls from concerned citizens, business owners, and women's advocacy groups demanding action. The media coverage had evolved from sympathetic reporting about a missing young woman to more critical examination of the police department's handling of the case. "Why wasn't this man identified sooner?" demanded Fatime Hosseini, spokesperson for the Tehran Women's Rights Association, during a press conference outside City Hall. "The evidence suggests he had been stalking multiple women for months. How many reports were filed? How many warning signs were ignored? This represents a systematic failure to protect women in our community." Captain Alizadeh found herself in the uncomfortable position of defending the investigation while acknowledging the validity of many of these concerns. The truth was that the previous harassment reports had been handled by different precincts, with no central coordination or pattern recognition. The individual cases had seemed isolated and relatively minor, not rising to the level of serious criminal investigation until Laleh's disappearance forced a broader examination of the evidence. "We have learned valuable lessons from this case," Alizadeh admitted during a public forum on women's safety. "We are implementing new protocols for tracking and analyzing harassment complaints, and we are working to better educate our officers about the warning signs of escalating stalking behavior. But I want to emphasize that our primary focus remains finding Laleh Nazari and ensuring that justice is served." The public pressure intensified when investigative journalists began examining other unsolved cases involving young women in the greater Tehrangrad area. A detailed analysis by the city's largest newspaper revealed that over the past 5 years, 7 women between the ages of 20 and 30 had gone missing under circumstances that shared certain similarities with Laleh's case. All had been employed in service industries, all had been described as attractive and outgoing, and all had disappeared without leaving clear evidence of their fate. While none of these previous cases could be definitively linked to Rahmani, the pattern raised disturbing questions about whether Laleh might be part of a larger series of crimes that had gone unrecognized by law enforcement. The newspaper's investigation prompted the police department to reopen several of these cold cases and examine them for possible connections. Detective Karimi found himself assigned to this expanded investigation, working with specialized units to review evidence from cases dating back several years. The work was painstaking and often depressing, but it yielded some interesting correlations. 3 of the previous missing women had been clients or employees of businesses that Romani's company had serviced. 2 others had lived or worked in neighborhoods where he had made sales calls during the relevant time periods. Most intriguingly, investigators discovered that Romani had requested vacation days or schedule changes that coincided with several of the disappearances. While this could be explained as coincidence, the pattern was suggestive enough to warrant deeper investigation. The breakthrough in understanding Romani's true psychology came from an unexpected source. His former therapist, Dr. Maryam Sadeghi, had treated Romani for anxiety and depression nearly 3 years earlier, before his obsession with Laleh had begun. When she learned of his arrest through media reports, she contacted the police with information that cast his behavior in a disturbing new light. "I want to be very careful about patient confidentiality," Dr. Sadeghi explained to Detective Alizada during their interview. "But given the circumstances and the potential danger to public safety, I believe I have an obligation to share certain information about Mr. Romani's psychological profile." According to Dr. Sadeghi, Romani had originally sought therapy after the end of a relationship with a coworker at his previous job. The relationship had lasted only a few months, but Romani had become increasingly possessive and controlling, ultimately leading to its termination and his resignation from the company. "What concerned me during our sessions was his complete inability to accept that the relationship had ended," Dr. Sadeghi recalled. He continued to believe that his former girlfriend was simply confused or had been influenced by others, and that eventually she would realize her mistake and return to him. Even after she had moved to another city and made it clear she wanted no further contact, he continued to monitor her social media accounts and make plans for their eventual reunion. More disturbing was Romani's response when Dr. Sadeghi had tried to help him understand the reality of the situation. Rather than working through his feelings of rejection and loss, he had become angry and accused the therapist of trying to sabotage his relationship. He had stormed out of their final session, declaring that no one understood what true love meant. In retrospect, I can see that he was already showing signs of the delusional thinking that apparently escalated with Miss Nazari, Dr. Sadeghi observed. But at the time, he seemed like someone dealing with a difficult breakup, not a potential danger to others. This information helped explain the progression of Romani's behavior, but it also raised new questions about his capacity for violence. If he had been capable of stalking and obsessing over multiple women over several years, what might have happened when reality finally collided with his delusions in an unavoidable way? The answer began to emerge when forensic analysts made a breakthrough in processing evidence from Romani's car. Using advanced techniques, they were able to identify microscopic traces of biological material that had been missed in the initial examination. The material was degraded and mixed with other substances, making analysis difficult. But preliminary tests suggested it was consistent with human blood. More significantly, they found soil samples embedded in the car's floor mats that did match the composition of dirt from any of the locations where Romani was known to have parked. The soil contained unusual mineral compositions that suggested it came from a specific geographical area, possibly near a construction site or industrial facility. Dr. Lena Makbar, the police department's chief forensic geologist, spent days analyzing the soil samples and comparing them to geological surveys of the greater Tehrangrad region. Her analysis narrowed the possible sources to a handful of locations, all within about 30 miles of the city center. The mineral profile is quite distinctive, Dr. Makbar explained to the investigation team. "We're looking at soil that contains high levels of gypsum and clay, combined with traces of industrial chemicals that suggest proximity to manufacturing facilities. There are perhaps 4 or 5 areas in the region that would produce this exact combination." Armed with this new evidence, the investigation team began the process of searching these specific locations for any sign of Laleh's remains. It was grim work, made more difficult by the industrial nature of many of the sites and the amount of heavy machinery and construction that had taken place in the intervening months. The search teams included not only police officers but also specialists in crime scene recovery, anthropologists, and volunteers from search and rescue organizations. They worked systematically through each location, using ground-penetrating radar, cadaver dogs, and careful visual examination of the terrain. On June 18th, exactly 3 months after Laleh's disappearance, the search teams made their first significant discovery in a remote area behind an abandoned cement factory about 25 miles southeast of Tehrangrad. Cadaver dogs detected the scent of human remains. The location was partially hidden by industrial debris and overgrown vegetation, accessible only via a rutted dirt road that would have been challenging to navigate in the dark. The recovery process was painstaking and heartbreaking. Working under the supervision of Dr. Hassan Amiri, the city's chief medical examiner, the team carefully excavated the site over the course of 2 days. What they found confirmed everyone's worst fears: the remains of a young woman, buried in a shallow grave and partially decomposed after months in the ground. The preliminary identification, based on dental records and personal effects found at the site, confirmed that they had found Laleh Nazari. The news hit her family like a physical blow, transforming their months of agonizing uncertainty into the devastating finality of confirmed loss. Laleh Nazari collapsed when Detective Karimi delivered the news personally at the family's apartment. Her husband Ali, the carpenter who had spent months printing flyers and organizing search parties, sat in stunned silence, his weathered hands trembling as he tried to process the information. "We knew," Setiget whispered through her tears. "Deep down, we knew, but hoping was all we had left." The discovery of Laleh's remains marked a crucial turning point in the case, transforming it definitively from a missing person investigation to a homicide. But it also opened new questions about the circumstances of her death and the extent of Rahmani's involvement. Dr. Amiri's preliminary examination of the remains suggested that Laleh had died from blunt force trauma to the head, consistent with being struck by a heavy object or thrown against a hard surface. The positioning of the body and the nature of the grave suggested that she had been killed elsewhere and transported to the burial site, supporting the theory that Rahmani had used his vehicle in the commission of the crime. But there were also puzzling elements that didn't fit neatly into the narrative the investigators had constructed. The burial site was much more remote and difficult to access than would seem necessary for someone acting impulsively or in a panic. The grave itself showed evidence of careful preparation, with tarps and chemical substances that suggested an attempt to accelerate decomposition and eliminate evidence. Most troubling of all was the discovery of a second set of tire tracks near the burial site, different from those left by Rahmani's Honda Accord. The tracks appeared to be from a larger vehicle, possibly a truck or SUV, and they suggested that someone else might have been present at the scene. Either Rahmani had an accomplice, or we're dealing with something much more complex than we originally thought, Detective Alizada observed as she reviewed the evidence from the recovery site. The level of planning and preparation suggests someone with experience in disposing of bodies, not a first-time killer acting on impulse. This possibility sent chills through the investigation team. If Rahmani had been working with someone else, it might explain how he had been able to carry out such an elaborate crime while maintaining his normal work schedule and daily routine. It might also explain some of the inconsistencies in his story and his continued denials of involvement in Laleh's death. The search for a possible accomplice led investigators back through all of Rahmani's known associates, co-workers, neighbors, family members, and acquaintances from his various activities and interests. They examined his phone records, financial transactions, and social media connections, looking for any pattern that might reveal a criminal partnership. What they found was a man who had been increasingly isolated in the months leading up to Laleh's death. His co-workers described him as competent but antisocial, someone who rarely participated in office gatherings or casual conversations. His neighbors knew him only as a quiet tenant who paid his rent on time, but had no apparent friends or romantic relationships. But buried in his phone records, investigators found something interesting. A series of calls to a number registered to a man named Omid Kabagar, who lived about 40 miles outside Tehrangrad, in a rural area known for its farming and small industry. The calls had become more frequent in the weeks leading up to Laleh's disappearance, and there had been a particularly long conversation on the night of March 14th, lasting nearly an hour. Omid Kargar turned out to be Rahmani's cousin, a man with a criminal record including assault and drug possession charges. More importantly, Kargar owned a red pickup truck that matched the tire impressions found at the burial site. When investigators attempted to locate him for questioning, they discovered that he had left town suddenly, just days after Laleh's remains were found, telling his landlord that he had found work in another province. The hunt for Omid Kargar became the investigation's new priority. Police bulletins were issued throughout the country, and his photograph was distributed to border checkpoints and transportation hubs. Meanwhile, investigators obtained search warrants for his abandoned apartment and the property where he had been living. The search of Kargar's residence yielded disturbing evidence that confirmed their worst fears. Hidden in a storage shed behind the main house, they found additional photographs of women who appeared to have been taken without their knowledge, as well as detailed maps of various neighborhoods throughout Tehrangrad. Most significantly, they discovered blood-stained clothing and cleaning supplies that suggested someone had attempted to remove biological evidence. DNA analysis confirmed that the blood belonged to Laleh Nazari, establishing a direct link between Kargar and the crime scene. But the discovery also raised new questions about the relationship between the two men and their respective roles in Laleh's murder. The investigation team developed a new theory. Rahmani had been the stalker and the planner. But when his delusions had finally led him to confront Laleh directly, he had enlisted his cousin's help in dealing with the consequences. Perhaps Laleh had rejected his advances or threatened to report his behavior to police, forcing him to silence her permanently. Kargar, with his criminal background and apparent lack of moral constraints, had provided the muscle and the expertise needed to dispose of the body and eliminate evidence. But as investigators dug deeper into the relationship between the two men, they uncovered evidence of an even more disturbing possibility. Phone records and financial transactions suggested that their partnership might have extended beyond just Laleh's case. There were patterns of communication and travel that coincided with several of the other unsolved disappearances they had been investigating. The scope of the investigation expanded once again as detectives worked to determine whether they were dealing with a pair of serial killers who had been operating in the Tehrangrad area for several years. The possibility that Laleh was not their only victim added urgency to the search for Omid Kargar and raised terrifying questions about how many other families might be living with the same uncertainty that had tormented the Nazaris for months. As summer deepened, the case consumed more and more resources and attracted increasing media attention. International news outlets picked up the story, framing it as an example of the dangers faced by young women in rapidly modernizing societies. Women's rights organizations organized rallies and awareness campaigns, using Laleh's story to highlight the need for better protection against stalking and harassment. The pressure on law enforcement to capture Omid Kargar intensified when investigators discovered evidence suggesting that he might still be in contact with other potential victims. Analysis of his phone and computer records revealed that he had been monitoring social media accounts belonging to several young women, collecting photographs and personal information in the same methodical way that Rahmani had stalked Laleh. Dr. Rostami, the forensic psychiatrist, provided a chilling assessment of what they might be dealing with. If our theory is correct, we have two individuals with complementary pathologies working together. Rahmani provides the obsessive focus and planning, while Kargar provides the willingness to use violence. This type of partnership can be extremely dangerous because it combines different skill sets and psychological drives in a way that makes detection more difficult. The hunt for Kargar took investigators across multiple provinces, following leads that took them from urban centers to remote, rural communities. They discovered that he had been using false identities and had established a network of casual acquaintances who helped him move around the country without leaving clear traces. But on July 2nd, nearly 4 months after Laleh's disappearance, the investigation received the break they had been hoping for. A truck driver in the northwestern province of Gilan reported seeing a man matching Kargar's description at a roadside rest stop, arguing with someone on a cell phone and appearing agitated. The truck driver had been following news coverage of the case and recognized Kargar from the photographs that had been circulated. Local police responded to the tip and found Kargar's red pickup truck parked behind an abandoned gas station about 10 miles from the rest stop. But Kargar himself was gone, apparently having fled on foot into the mountainous terrain that characterized the region. A massive manhunt was launched, involving hundreds of police officers, search dogs, and helicopter patrols. The rugged landscape made the search extremely difficult, with dense forests, steep ravines, and numerous caves that could provide hiding places for someone familiar with the area. As the search entered its third day, investigators made a discovery that would change the entire case. Hidden in Kargar's truck, they found a detailed journal that documented not only his involvement in Laleh's murder, but also his participation in several other crimes over the past 3 years. The journal entries were written in a crude, barely literate style, but their content was clear and terrifying. Kargar had recorded the details of at least 6 other murders, describing his victims as problems that needed to be solved for his cousin Ben. In each case, Romani had identified and stalked a woman, and Kargar had handled the violent aspects of eliminating her when she failed to respond to Romani's advances. The names in the journal matched several of the unsolved missing person cases that investigators had been examining, confirming their worst fears about the scope of the killings. But even more disturbing was what the journal revealed about the psychology of the partnership. Kargar genuinely seemed to believe that he was helping his cousin find love, that the murders were necessary steps in some twisted romantic process. In one particularly chilling entry, dated just weeks before Layla's death, Kargar had written, "B. says the nail girl is ready for the next step. She keeps ignoring his messages like the others did. Time to help her understand how much he cares." The discovery of the journal transformed the case from a single murder investigation to one of the most significant serial killer cases in the country's recent history. The media coverage became even more intense, and families of other missing women began contacting police to see if their loved ones might be among Kargar's victims. But Kargar himself remained at large, somewhere in the mountainous wilderness of Gilan province. As rescue teams continued their search, investigators worried that he might be planning to contact other potential accomplices or to target new victims. The journal had made it clear that he saw killing as a solution to problems, and his current situation as a fugitive certainly qualified as a problem in his mind. The search took a dramatic turn on July 5th, when hunters in the remote Alborz Mountains reported hearing gunshots and seeing smoke rising from a valley about 15 miles from where Kargar's truck had been found. Police helicopters were dispatched to investigate, and they spotted a small cabin tucked into a grove of trees near a mountain stream. As tactical officers surrounded the cabin, they could see movement inside, but attempts to establish communication with whoever was inside were unsuccessful. Smoke continued to pour from the chimney, and there were signs that someone had been living there, recently clothes hanging on a line, fresh tire tracks, and food scraps that hadn't been there long enough to attract scavengers. The standoff continued for hours, with police negotiators using loudspeakers to try to convince Kargar to surrender peacefully. But as evening approached, the situation took a sudden and unexpected turn. Flames began to appear in the cabin windows, and it became clear that whoever was inside had set the structure on fire. Tactical officers rushed toward the burning building, hoping to rescue anyone inside. But they were driven back by the intensity of the flames and the sound of ammunition exploding in the heat. By the time the fire had burned itself out, nothing remained of the cabin except smoldering ruins and the charred remains of what had been someone's final refuge. The search of the burned cabin site would take days to complete, as investigators carefully sifted through ash and debris, looking for evidence of what had happened in those final hours. Early indications suggested that at least one person had died in the fire, but formal identification would have to wait for forensic analysis of the remains. As news of the cabin fire spread, the investigation team found themselves facing a new set of questions. If Ahmed Kargar had indeed died in the blaze, had he acted alone, or might there be other accomplices still at large? and what secrets had burned with him in that remote mountain cabin, secrets that might have provided closure for the families of other victims. The answers would determine whether the Laleh Nazari case was finally approaching its conclusion, or whether the darkest chapters were yet to be revealed.